streaming, and then
Yes,
give me a thumbs up when you're ready and I'll start.
Yeah, I did it.
Cool. Okay, well, welcome to the morning edition of Product People. This is a first time we're doing it in the morning, so please give feedback afterwards. We want to be as respectful as possible for people's morning routines. So we'll shortly go into the talk. Any questions you have, please leave them in the comments and I'll read them out, and we can have a Q&A at the end. And that's mainly it. I'm going to hand over the reins over to AJ from Komoot, who will talk to us about imposter syndrome. So I'll stop sharing. And AJ, the floor is yours.
Amazing, thanks, Riz. Right, I'll just see if we can share my screen. Okay, can you see my pretty face in the trees?
Yes.
Yes.
Amazing, right. Well, thank you very much for having me. Before I actually get going with this talk, I do want to make a slightly serious point, which is that I'm not a clinical psychologist. If anybody's experiencing any serious work-based anxiety or any other mental health conditions, I really urge that you seek the correct advice from a professional in that field and not some guy on a video call or on YouTube. So with that out of the way, I'm AD and I'm an imposter. I shouldn't be here talking to you about this because I'm not good enough to do that. But here I am. I'm going to talk to you about my own experiences with imposter syndrome and share some ways that I've learned to deal with it. So hopefully you can better equip yourselves if you're experiencing the same sort of feelings. I just come out of presenter mode. Can you still see that okay? Now, I talk to you as the product manager responsible for growth at Komoot. Komoot is an outdoor app helping people explore more and get the most from the outdoors. Now, together, we are building the world's largest community of outdoor explorers. On my journey to this position, I've held a whole host of different positions, some senior and others not so senior, which have all helped me shape my experience professionally. Now, in most of them, at some time or other, I have experienced imposter syndrome. But what exactly is imposter syndrome? Imposter syndrome, also known as imposter phenomenon, fraud syndrome, perceived fraudulence, or imposter experience, it describes high-achieving individuals who, despite their objective successes, fail to internalize their accomplishments and have persistent self-doubt and fear of being exposed as a fraud or imposter. Now, generally, people with imposter syndrome struggle with accurately attributing their performance to their actual competence. So let's have a quick look at some examples. Have you ever thought, what if somebody notices that I don't know what I'm doing? Or why do people put so much faith in me? Or anything kind of similar to that? Well, if you do, don't worry, you're in good company. Here are some other quotes about imposter syndrome that may sound familiar. These are comments taken from some of society's highest achievers about the way that they have at some point or other viewed themselves. And many high achieving people continue to have these feelings well into their senior positions, apart from the two dead ones, obviously. Dr. Valerie Young has done a lot of work on imposter syndrome, and she's someone that's worth looking at. I encourage all of you to have a listen to some of the material that she's produced and have a read of her book, which is called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. Now, many of the lessons in there are completely transferable to men, so I do recommend picking up a copy, whichever gender you align with. As part of her descriptions of imposter syndrome, Dr. Young categorized people who experience imposter syndrome into 5 subcategories. In my personal opinion, you can fall into one or more of these categories. I'm not the biggest fan of putting people in 2 tight boxes. I personally see myself in 2 of them, which I'll go into in slightly more depth than the other 3 because I've got slightly more personal experience with those. Understanding how you align with these is something that I've found useful. It's useful in understanding how you can combat the negative aspects of imposter syndrome and hopefully how you can make them a benefit rather than a burden. So the 5 categories are the perfectionist, the superwoman, superman, the natural genius, the soloist, and the expert. So starting at the perfectionist. Perfectionists by their nature will strive for perfection and will do this by setting unreasonably high goals for themselves. Although this can be a good thing, as striving for perfection is important, it can be quite destructive, as when the goals are not achieved, which often they won't be because perfection is an illusion, a perfectionist will experience self-doubt and shame at not having come up short. So, are you a perfectionist? You might be a perfectionist if you have ever been accused of being a micromanager, if you find delegating a challenge, if you dwell for a long time when you perceive that you failed, or if you feel like 100% is really the minimum you should be aiming for. Now, as a perfectionist, you can fall into the trap of rarely finding successes or being satisfied with results because they can always be better. Now, this isn't only destructive for you, but can also have a negative effect on your colleagues and teammates. What you'll need to learn is to take mistakes in your stride. Although it's good to continue striving for perfection, you must also accept that a slightly watered down version of perfection, so that you don't demotivate your colleagues or burn yourself out. You need to avoid over planning, as that can be something that's quite destructive, and it can actually prevent you from finishing a project or even at times even starting a project. There's rarely going to be a perfect time to begin or to launch, and it's rare that something can be 100%. It's equally rare that product managers have the luxury of knowing it all. So the perfectionist needs to accept some balance into their world. Secondly, the superwoman or superman. Super people try to cover their own insecurities with trying to overachieve in every aspect of their life. Now, this is one of the areas that I fall into. I'm the guy who answers Slack at every hour, even when I'm on vacation. In my leisure time, I consider anything that doesn't move me forward in some way to be a waste of time. For example, I quite like running and cycling. So a few years ago, I took up triathlon. This meant that my leisure time, instead of being spent relaxing, could be measured in watts per kilo or heartbeats per minute. From there, I went on to become a cycle coach. I coached every weekend until COVID hit. I started racing cyclocross, which is kind of off-road biking. I then took on the role of the chairperson of the cycle club and went on to organise time trials. And now here I am doing speaking gigs just for good measure. Though this seems to be a great approach to becoming what people might consider a high achieving person, you need to be cognizant that it can also be quite damaging. In my last appraisal I received this feedback from a colleague. They said that I need to stop offering to answer messages and pings when I'm on vacation. While it's cool that I have answers, it's detrimental in the long run, and they found that that could be both from a mental health perspective, but also that it was setting the wrong expectations about hand-holding for everything. Now, it's awesome that I can get such clear feedback from my extremely supportive team, but it does demonstrate that our actions, however well-intended, can affect those around you as well as you. So, you might be a super person if you're the person who stays later at the office than the rest of the team, even when the work is done. If you find downtime to be wasteful, and that downtime must have a defined outcome, do you sacrifice hobbies for work time or feel like you haven't truly earned your title despite having numerous degrees and achievements? Do you feel pressed to work harder and longer than those around you so you can prove your worth? Now, people who fall into the superperson category feel they must fill the time with additional things to feel self-worth and not be spotted as the phony among their real deal colleagues. It doesn't work. It'll make you more likely to take on too many things at a time. You'll try and deliver 6 projects instead of 1, and you'll generally overwhelm yourself and others. If you have the superperson trait, you should focus on getting validation from your inner confidence and outcomes of the things that you do, rather than an act of presenteeism. Try to focus on the journey and approach tasks as an adventure. Try to veer away from external validation. So what I'm trying to say is that you should do things for you, not for the praise or the perception from others, and ensure that the reason behind the work you do is aligned to the outcomes that are expected. Now, something to be aware of is that when a superperson is also a perfectionist, it can cause quite a serious negative feedback loop that's really self-perpetuating. Don't take on too much at a time to prove your ability to handle more than anyone else. It just annoys people. Next up, the natural genius. So natural genius is the second subgroup that I fall into, and I appreciate that it sounds quite arrogant to refer to oneself as a natural genius, but today I want to speak as openly as I possibly can, and I didn't name the groups, so that's down to Valerie Young. Dr. Young says that a natural genius or natural geniuses expect to be brilliant at everything first time, and they feel shame if they're not. So often the natural genius is the person who gets straight A's with seemingly little effort. I personally don't quite fall into that specific trait. Formal education, and I did not marry bedfellows make. I also don't have a degree. The whole education thing just didn't work for me. I had to find a different route. The challenge with being in this subgroup, though, is that we set the bar extremely high in a similar way to perfectionists. But rather than just setting the bar high, we also expect to be able to jump it first time. Now, even still now, if I don't manage to get to grips with a concept quickly or first time, I find myself asking if I should just stop being a product manager. I wonder whether my team would rather I just went back to, say, working in a bar or doing something where I knew what I was doing rather than doing my current role. Not sure if this applies to you. Are you someone who quickly grasps complex concepts? Were you told frequently as a child that you were the smart one in your family or in your peer group? Do you avoid some challenges under the guise of knowing your limits because it's uncomfortable to do something you're not great at? If so, you can combat this by focusing on things that you don't just get straight away. This will give you a good opportunities to learn not only about that specific subject, but also give you a way to build empathy with others who choose to work through things in a more methodological way. Now, as a natural genius, you will have the benefit of being willing to make quite quick decisions and come to conclusions quickly. You do need to be aware, though, that this can trip you up. And if it does, that's when imposter syndrome will bite super hard if you get something wrong by making a fast decision. So again, try focusing on yourself as an ongoing project rather than the finished article. Identify behaviours that you can change and improve over time, and seek out things that put you out of your comfort zone. A natural genius will tend to avoid things that they perceive as a threat to their intellect. So, for example, do a talk on imposter syndrome to hundreds of people that you don't know, because that'll really sort of push you well out of your comfort zone. Okay, next up is the soloist. Does asking for help equal failure? Soloists are independent to a fault. They're likely to consider outside assistance to be a threat to their identity and think that if things are not achieved on their own, then the outside world will consider them a failure or a cheat. You could be a soloist if you believed that things must be achieved on your own. Do you consider teamwork to be a threat to your identity, or that it might steal some of your deserved recognition? Does the phrase, "I don't need anyone's help," is that a phrase that's used quite often? Does this sound like you? Now, when a soloist feels like an imposter, it will often be when they are offered help. And the very act of offering assistance is a demonstration of their inability. You've got to learn to embrace collaboration and to allow others in. The lone wolf who flies solo and then descends from the mountain with all of the answers and gets hailed as a hero is an absolute myth. It shouldn't be strived for, and it's got no real place in product management. You've got to share in both your failures and your successes, and then you'll find that the feelings of imposterishness are lessened. Finally, we have the expert. Experts measure their worth by how much they know, and they put a disproportionate amount of value on knowledge. An expert can never know too much. The difficulty here is that there's always someone who knows more than you. And as a product manager, you need such a broad set of knowledge and experience that you'll often find that you're surrounded by people who know more than you in their specific area. That's kind of the way it's supposed to be. The challenge here is not taking it as a personal affront or considering yourself a failure because your dev team know more about C# than you do. Product managers need to be broader than they are deep in their knowledge so that the actual experts can be the experts. So you may fall into the expert subcategory if you're the sort of person who shies away from applying to job posts unless you meet every single education requirement. If you're constantly seeking out trainings or certification because you think you need to improve your skills in order to succeed. Even when you've been in your role for some time, can you relate to feeling like it's still like you still don't know enough? And do you shudder when someone says that you're an expert? Coming to terms with the expert trait can be hard because an expert wants to be the holder of all knowledge. Now, this can be destructive in more than one way. Some experts will feel extremely disheartened when someone knows more than they do or is perceived to know more than they do. One of the most destructive things that an expert can do is to deliberately surround themselves with less knowledgeable people because that weakens the team. Experts should actively seek out situations where they have more knowledgeable people so they can have a better understanding of the variation of skills that are required for a highly functioning team. Use feelings of imposterism as opportunities to seek out new learnings, but focus not on what you don't know, but what opportunities you have for learning. So, they're the 5 subcategories of personality identified by Dr. Young. She has a website, which is impostersyndrome.com. So I do urge you to go and take a look if you feel that this applies to you. So next thing, what about the Dunning-Kruger effect? The Dunning-Kruger effect relates to imposter syndrome. In many ways, I kind of think that Dunning-Kruger effect is kind of the opposite of imposter syndrome. And I think that the two should be viewed, if not side by side, then at least with some knowledge of each other. The Dunning-Kruger effect is defined as a cognitive bias in which people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. Or to put it another way, the less you know about a subject, the more likely you are to think that you're an expert in it. So what can we take from this? Is it that by thinking we're good at something, we can automatically deduce that we're not good at it? Or is it better to accept that by our nature, humans are bad at self-assessment? Now, for me, I prefer the latter. Humans are rubbish at assessing their own ability at doing stuff. You may have seen this chart that reportedly describes the Dunning-Kruger effect, where initially you hit the peak of Mount Stupid before you drop into the Valley of Despair, go up the slope of enlightenment, etc. Now, this is actually quite a misleading chart, and it really highlights the dangers of the internet more than it does Dunning-Kruger, because this wasn't any part of the original study. The correct graph, oops, looks like this. Sorry, I've got my slides slightly out of order. There we are. So the correct graph looks like this. Now, this is taken from the original paper, Unskilled and Unaware of It, How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Lead to Inflated Self-Assessment. Now, this is published in 1999. As a product manager, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, you will likely fall into the 3rd or 4th quartile of this chart. And as such, I mean, you're demonstrably competent. The problem occurs that once you're there, you can look back and see, with the benefit of hindsight, how far your previous perceptions were. And then you'll apply that to your current position. So we're talking about this gap here. You'll apply that to your current position, and you'll assume that you must still be massively overestimating your ability. And this is where doubts can start to arise. Now, as a side note, this is not a new concept. 2,500 years ago, thinkers were already aware of these phenomenon. Confucius said, "The more I know, the more I realize I know nothing." And Socrates the more I know, the more I realise I know nothing. I've got those two the wrong way around. Confucius said, real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. So, how do the Dunning-Kruger and imposter syndrome relate? I got this rather nice little chart from this Index, which is a great site at kind of explaining quite complex ideas in super easy ways. Both Dunning-Kruger and imposter syndrome are misalignments of your perceived level of expertise and your ability. But how does this specifically relate to product management? Imposter syndrome is more prevalent in creative roles and roles without clearly set definitions and boundaries. Product management, by its nature, is nebulous. It has hazy boundaries and often a very long payoff. In more clearly defined roles, professionals have much quicker feedback loops and clearly defined success criteria, which help to keep the imposter syndrome at bay. As a product manager, you may be you may be having to wait weeks or months for a payoff. And until that point, you may be in a position of limbo, just questioning if you know what you're doing or not. Now, remember that imposter syndrome is prevalent in high achieving individuals, which means that if you're experiencing it, then the likelihood is that you should be in that role that you're in. The time to start questioning yourself is when you have nothing left to learn. If you're at that point, then either there's a whole load you don't even know yet, aka Dunning-Kruger and your perception of what you know, or it's time for you to move on to another role where you can continue your learning. Having things to learn is a good thing. Being in a non-learning role will result in stagnation and poor performance. Just make sure that you don't assume that you know everything. So how can this help you as a product manager? Firstly, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, then you're already doing well. You're in a position that's challenging you and giving you the opportunity to learn. All you need to do now is build on that opportunity. But you must be careful not to fall into the negative behaviours associated with your personal subcategory, such as, for example, destructive overplanning if you're a perfectionist. Identify the subcategories that apply to you and identify the negative traits of that personality. You can then use it to build on the positives, identify learning opportunities and use those for self-development and to build better products. As a product manager, you're a senior individual who still has these anxieties. They won't go away the more senior you become. There's a saying in cycling, it never gets easier, you just get faster. And that can be used here too. As you become more experienced, you'll find that there are things that you don't know how to do. And each time you do, you'll experience the same feelings of doubt because it's new to you and you've just got to go puzzle it out. Everyone is making it up as they go along to some degree or other. Now, I remember when I was young and my parents did everything for me, even well into my 20s, if I'm honest. I always thought, it's okay, I'll know what to do when I get older, or when I'm an adult, I'll have this all figured out. But now as I'm careering towards 40, I realise that really my parents didn't know what they were doing any more than I do. I still don't really feel like I know how to do half the stuff in my day-to-day. And yet I've helped loads of people all the time, including my mum. And it's in things that I thought she just knew how to do 30 years ago. It turns out that we're all winging it to some degree or other, and that's part of the learning process. So how can you work to overcome it? And what can you do about feelings of imposterism? First of all, as I said, try and understand those subcategories that align to you and the pitfalls associated with them. Don't question yourself, question your knowledge. Don't freeze. Take control of the situation, harness your enthusiasm and seek out the learnings. You're getting these anxieties because you want to do well. You've got to try and cast the negative thoughts aside and try and give them little value. It's really, really important as well that you trust your boss. If you trust your boss, then you can share things with them and ask them questions. It's likely that they experience the same sort of feelings that you do. They'll have had to do things for the first time at some point in their careers too. If you don't trust your boss, then to be honest, I'd recommend seeking employment somewhere else. I do appreciate that's quite an idyllic view and it's not quite that straightforward for people. But if you can't trust your boss as a product manager, then I don't really see how you can do your job. If you do trust them, however, then you should be confident in their ability to hire good people. And one of those good people is you. Find solace in that. They saw in you the qualities that are required for the role. And in my experience of working with board level individuals, entrepreneurs and business owners, they won't keep it to themselves if they feel that you aren't performing. Make sure you don't try and fake it till you make it. Faking it will emphasize your feelings of being phony. In really high performing individuals, they never make it. They always want to do better and will always view where they are to be a stepping stone to further success. Instead, try and own the process. It's what you do every day that's important. And if you own each step along the way, then the results will be the best results achievable. As such, you should focus on process, not outcomes. Goals by their nature are too short term. For example, I have the goal of having a tidy kitchen. I can achieve that easily. I'll just go tidy it. But it will just get messy again. What I need to do is focus on the process. I want to be the type of person who puts their pots away as soon as they're finished with them. Then I don't need to think about having a tidy kitchen because it will just be tidy. Similar things can be said for learning a musical instrument. Everybody wants to be able to play guitar, but very few people want to spend the time learning to play. Use this in your own day-to-day role. Rather than focusing on, I'm going to be found out, focus on, am I taking the right steps to solve whatever the problem is? You can't share it away. You can't share away feelings of imposter syndrome. Though I do encourage everybody to share your anxieties and talk about them. You also need to be super careful not to spend time dwelling on them. Thoughts of inadequacy are unwelcomed and unhealthy. They're thoughts that should be cast aside as things of little value. Try and change your personal narrative and take control of your thoughts so that you can focus on what you can learn and not what you don't know. So to round this off, some tips from me that you can either take or discard. Ultimately, you have to recognize in yourself that thoughts aren't facts. Just because you think you're the imposter doesn't mean you are. Unwelcome and obsessive thoughts are destructive. Understand yours and head them off. Don't give them power. Your boss is winging it too, but you should still trust them. Don't expect to be happy all the time. It's unrealistic. Set your vision at a realistic place. Remember that product management is an adventure and not a race. And finally, don't listen to me because I don't belong here. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very, very much for sharing. I found myself nodding along to a lot of that. So thank you. We have 12 minutes or so for questions before we cut this one off. I'm just having a look at the questions, so feel free to submit them. I'll start with one actually, which I kind of, in those 5 categories you put out, like Dr. Young kind of suggested that we might fall into. I thought the soloist was interesting, not necessarily because I recognize myself, but more in many ways PMs are set up to be soloists, right? Like you can have a team of engineers and maybe like a tester or two, but there's often only one PM in a team. So in many ways we're forced to think that we are solo. Like, have you encountered that? How would you suggest PMs step out of that situation?
I think I completely agree with what you're saying. As a product manager or product owner, you tend to sit kind of owning the whole product. The way that I try and approach it is you've got to remember that as a product manager, you shouldn't be turning up with the answers. I don't think that's the role of a product manager. What you need to be doing is identifying kind of what the problems are and then working with a solutions development team to come up with a joint solution. So I try to consider myself as being the glue that holds it together rather than something that sits above and tells people what to do. if you try to go it solo, then you stand a high chance of annoying your team, because you kind of just turn up and you tell the engineers how to do their job. You'll end up art directing the designers, and the fact is that as a product manager, your design team should be better at designing than you are. Your engineers should be better at writing code than you are. So if you don't include them in the conceptual stage, then all that'll happen is you end up producing something which you came up with, and that won't be as good a product. So try to immerse yourself in the team. You should be part of the team, not sitting outside it.
Cool. Really great answer. We have a question from, I might pronounce this wrong, so I'm sorry, Jean Denis. I'm going to assume it's a French name. The question is, was the imposter syndrome even stronger for you when you landed your first PM role?
No, I think when I've experienced my worst imposter syndrome, it tends to be kind of 3 or 4 months into the role. So you land a role, and it's not just product management, it's whatever the role is. You land the role, you're excited about it, you get in and you're all like, yeah, this is cool. I don't know anything about this, and I've got time to learn. And then after like 3 months, I remember a few years ago, I'd started, I had a new client when I worked in an agency, and well, new to me because I just started there. And I went for a meeting with them like in my 2nd week, and they were really, really nice. And then I had a call with them kind of 3 or 4 months in, and they said, oh, well, you've been here for 4 months, so you should know how to do everything. And it's just like, what? I definitely don't know how to do any of this. So it tends to be when, it's when you get to the point where you're like, I should know all of this. So yeah, it's not straight away. It tends to be a little bit far in. And that's, for me, it's not just in a new role. So when I'm leading projects in my current role, you'll kick off a project, and it could be a short one for a couple of weeks, or maybe a long one that lasts 6 months. Particularly on the long ones, you get like a month in, and people expect you to know literally everything about it, and sometimes you don't, and you think, oh no, what am I doing? So no, it tends to come a little bit later. The first bit's fine, because that's the bit where you're going, oh, this is easy, I definitely know stuff, and there's stuff to find out. It's when you think you should know more that it hits.
Cool. Just looking at the questions. We have more time if people want to submit questions. I actually have another one, if you don't mind. If you don't mind indulging me, feel like this is just turning into a chat. But how have you found, like, recognizing that everyone suffers from some form of imposter syndrome? How have you found that change the way you approach your job and the way you work with your colleagues, your bosses, board level people you mentioned?
I think that when I experience imposter syndrome, it's one of the things that I tell myself, because I found that previously, when feeling like I don't belong, that's when you can kind of spiral down into a really sort of depressive phase where you become, you lose a lot of confidence in what you're doing. And that's the time that really I've got to say, hang on, everybody to some degree or other is having to make it up as they go along. Everybody has stuff that they don't know. So it's more in, for me, remembering that other people feel that way, so that kind of validates my feelings and helps me work through it. But also looking the other way, trying to support people historically who are maybe more junior than I am, and letting them know that it's okay not to know how to do everything all the time. And I think that what you've got to try and do in that is open up channels of communication. If you can have really good quality open communication right across all levels of seniority, and that you can be strong enough to admit to your leaders that the stuff that you don't know how to do, then that will ultimately help you grow and help you with what you're doing. And it's just a really, really positive thing. I mentioned about trusting your boss. I think that, and I appreciate it's like a super idyllic way of looking at things, because people can't just move careers. But if you're in a position where you don't feel that you can speak to your boss, or you don't trust them, or you don't feel that you can tell them there's things that you don't get, then it's quite destructive, because it prevents your ability to grow and learn. So that's something that definitely needs to be addressed. Communication's really at the heart of it.
Cool. Thanks for the answer. We have a question in the chat, which I'll read out. Can imposter syndrome be more prevalent in certain organizations, and does it get amplified based on the culture of the company? Very good question.
So yes, I would say it would. Say it does. If a company culture is extremely target driven, I mean, everybody needs targets, KPIs, OKRs are all really, really good things, and you've got to keep a focus on, you know, where you're trying to get to as a business. But companies that are overly focused on targets over culture can lead to increased levels of imposter syndrome. Also, some research suggests that pardon, my dog's working up in the background for that. So if you're from an underrepresented group by your ethnicity or your sexuality or your gender in your company, then that can also lead to increased feelings of imposter syndrome. So that's quite an interesting little area as well. Sorry, I got distracted by the dog halfway through there. Does that make sense?
No. Yeah, for sure. What's really nice is that dogs don't suffer from imposter syndrome. They know exactly what they are, what they do, what they're good at.
Absolutely.
We have a question from YouTube, actually. I'll read out. So how do you handle imposter syndrome from the other side? Mainly other people who might have imposter syndrome, how do you help them? And even, if you mind asking, how do you help them when it potentially gets a bit annoying, where like they keep having this self-doubt? How do you navigate that?
I think with anything like this, you've got to be as supportive as possible. And if you're finding that it's annoying, then maybe you're not the right person to help that person. You've got to be supportive, but I think also you've got to encourage people to be able to share openly, but particularly with things like imposter syndrome or other negative, unwelcome and recurring thoughts. It's about not giving those thoughts power, and people need to be able to think of the way I do it, and I get kind of unwelcome thoughts, not only about imposter syndrome, but about other things. And you've got to try not to give them power and not over concentrate on them. The way I often think about it is kind of saying, you know, these are silly thoughts and just cast them aside and move on. So if you're trying to help someone with imposter syndrome, you've got to acknowledge that they have these feelings and that it's normal. If they are having it an awful lot, then I would encourage them to go and see someone who's a professional in it. And if you're not, then maybe you're not, like I say, not the right person. But generally, it's about supporting and making sure that people have open channels of communication.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm just looking at any questions. We have no further questions, and there's 2 minutes left. So rather than running up to 9, I'm thinking that maybe a good time to stop would be now, unless anyone wants one final question. Otherwise, I will end it by saying thank you to everyone. Thank you to AD very much for the very, very great talk and the great Q&A. To anyone who's on the stream and is interested in more events, please come through to the Meetup channel, to the group. You can join us on Telegram if you really want to support us as a patron as well. But there's many, many events. This is the first morning one, as I mentioned, and I'm sure there will be more. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, and there's also events in the evenings as well, weekly, I believe. So yeah, I hope to see you at the next one. So thank you once again to Adrian. Thank you to everyone joining. And that's it. Bye.